and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 21. The House of Afrasiyab.
Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening.
So last time we discussed the rise of the Samanid Emirate, how a family of provincial Persian nobles from Transoxiana rose from obscurity to create a rich and powerful emirate in the chaos caused by the anarchy at Samarra. The Samanids led a flowering of art, science, philosophy, and Persian culture, and also created a Turkish slave army that became increasingly politically powerful with the ability to overthrow the dynasty itself. Now, I don't want to accuse them of copying the early Abbasids, but as they say, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Now, as we discussed, a key part of the Samanid legitimation was their status as Ghazis, holy warriors leading a great jihad against the infidel. And as the Samanid territories bordered the steppes of Central Asia, the infidels that they bordered were the Turks. So this great Samanid jihad was directed north into the steppe world, and as we will discuss today, it fundamentally changed the nature of the steppe world, ultimately bringing into existence the undertakers of the Samanid state and paving the way for the rise of the Seljuks. Now, the Samanid jihad itself was not designed to bring the Turks into Islam. It was more about enslaving them and taking their stuff rather than forcibly converting them. Yet, nevertheless, the jihad probably did help to spread Islam among the Turks. For one thing, seeing victorious armies ravage your lands in this time would have been seen by many as proof of the correctness of their faith. Like I said when we discussed the early Muslim conquest, this can be a bit hard for us in the modern world to really intuitively grasp, but at this time, everything was seen as having a divine component or reason. If God let your people be conquered like this, there must have been a reason for it. And for many people, the most logical reason is that God is on the side of the conquerors, and that means that their religion is correct. Additionally, when the Ghazis captured and enslaved Turks during the jihad, the Turks would often be converted to Islam. And when the Samanid Emirate began to build a great Turkish slave army under the reign of Ahmad, the Turkish Mamelukes would always be converted to Islam. So as time went on, and particularly after the Samanid slave army dramatically expanded in size, there came to be relatively large numbers of Muslim Turkish slaves in the lands of the Emirate. Sometimes these enslaved Turks would then return to the steppe and bring their new religion back with them. Remember that the frontier world was fluid, with people moving back and forth from the settled lands of the Samanids to the steppe world of the Turks. Turkish slave soldiers in particular could amass a great deal of wealth and then return to their steppe world of their birth as rich and respected men. Remember that the Turkish slave soldiers likely did not focus too much on their legal status as enslaved property of their master, and instead likely saw the institution of slavery as being bound to the lord who purchased them in the traditional mode of steppe obligations of loyalty, which themselves carried reciprocal obligations from the master. If events resulted in their master breaking his side of the bargain, namely not providing them with plunder and loot, they might just leave and go back to the steppe. Additionally, many Turkish Mamelukes would be manumitted or purchase their freedom at some point in their career, and some would then return to the steppe. However they returned to the steppe world of their birth, a great many Turkish former Mamelukes kept the religion of Islam, adopted during their enslavement. In some cases, this was no doubt due to sincere belief, but Islam was also very useful to the Turks. It was an important part of making them acceptable to the sedentary world. It made them part of the club, so to speak. It made them less alien to the settled Islamic civilization that they bordered, and it made relations with that rich settled world incomparably easier. They could approach the denizens of the settled world, merchants, nobles, government officials, on their terms. And remember, as always, the nomadic world was deeply entwined with the settled civilization that it bordered. But it wasn't just through jihad and slave soldiers that Islam spread among the Turks. At the same time that the Samanids were sending out their armies of Ghazis, they were also sending out missionaries. The Samanids, of course, sent out Orthodox Sunni missionaries who deliberately traveled to the courts and encampments of powerful Turkish tribes to convince the leadership of the Turks to convert, ideally to the Sunni orthodoxy of the Samanids. We have frustratingly few mentions in the sources to specific missionaries leaving the Samanid realms to preach among the Turks. Really, only 2 men are mentioned in detail, and both were Orthodox Sunni Muslims spreading the faith of the Samanid court. But while the histories only mention 2 men, many, many more must have traveled across the steppe to preach to the Turks. Perhaps the sources only mention the Orthodox Sunni missionaries sent to the elites of the Turkish world by the Samanid court itself, because the authors of the time only really cared about the conversion of the elites. Likely, though we can't be certain, far more influential than the Orthodox Sunnis preaching to the Turkish elites were the wandering Sufi mystics, traveling across the steppe and spreading looser, more heterodox forms of Islam among the common people, forms of Islam that could coexist with the shamanic practices of the Turks. Though our sources are largely silent on this, given the nature of Islamic beliefs attested to among the common Turkish nomads, it is likely in this way that the bulk of the Turkish people came to be introduced to Islam. In addition to the jihad and the work of missionaries, the Samanid era also saw Muslim colonization and settlement on the steppe, along with Turkish migration into the lands of the Emirate. A continuous blurring of the line between the steppe and sedentary worlds that would have long-reaching consequences. The Great Samanid Jihad resulted in large numbers of Ghazis moving into the Samanid domains, and as the state became wealthy and prosperous, the population of course boomed, overflowing the ancient Silk Road cities of Central Asia. The Samanids came to establish colonies and towns on the steppes themselves, in part to project their power over the steppe and create a buffer between their core population centers and the Turks. These towns therefore existed on the fringe of Samanid and Turkish worlds, and they were of course populated by Muslims. But at the same time, they were likely sanctioned by local Turkish warlords and chieftains who saw their importance in establishing places of commerce with the rich settled lands. And as we discussed back in episode 16, there were already some small Turkish settlements on the steppes which had large Muslim populations, relatively speaking. As trade between the new settlements and the Turkish settlements grew, more and more Turks took up the religion of the settled world. They were often encouraged in doing this by their Muslim trading partners, who wanted to make sure that they would be subject to the same Sharia rules regarding contract and commercial law. And at the same time, tribes of Turks were beginning to migrate into the Samanid realms themselves. There are fleeting references in the sources to free Turkish tribes moving into the steppes and deserts of the Emirate, between the great cities, and adopting Islam in the process. Indeed, as we will discuss next time, one of the tribes doing this in the late 900s was an obscure Oghuz clan led by a man named Seljuk. And of course, these tribes were nomadic and would both travel within the Samanid Emirate and back across the porous border of the frontier to the steppes, bringing their new religion back with them. So all of this added up to both a blurring of the already fluid border between the steppe and the lands of Islam, and to a corresponding massive spread of Islam among the Turks throughout the 10th century. Now, we don't have accurate numbers, but over the course of the 10th century, Islam came to be professed by a substantial portion of the Turkish population, though we can't say if it was yet a majority religion. The Islamic sources refer occasionally to mass conversions during the period. Ibn al-Athir's history, for example, says that in 960, 10,000 tents of infidel Turks who used to make nocturnal raids on Muslim towns in the region of Balughstan and Khorasan embraced Islam. Whatever the details, we can say for sure that Islam was growing among the Turks and that it was particularly popular among the Turkish political and economic elite, the people who had to deal with the settled world the most. And we also know that, largely, the religion was spread by missionaries and by merchants, and not by the sword. These Islamized Turks were initially termed Turkmen by the Muslim sources. Later, Turkmen would come to mean the nomadic Turks as opposed to the sedentary Turks, and even later, it would come to be an ethnic label for a particular group of Oghuz Turks. But initially, it seems that it was largely used to refer to any Muslim Turk. Al-Biruni says that the Oghuz call any Turk who converts to Islam a Turkmen. The first great Turkologist in history, Mahmud al-Kashgari, who lived in the early 11th century, refers to some Karluk Turks as Turkmen, but he also says, The Oghuz are Turkmen. I think clearly the label was a bit fluid, but in general referred to any Turk who converted. It's just that because most of the Turks who bordered the caliphate were Oghuz, there was a great deal of overlap with the Oghuz, and the term over time came to be more and more associated with the Oghuz Turks to the exclusion of other Turkic peoples. The Islamization of the Turks and the growth of Samanid power were also deeply entwined with the creation of a new state on the steppe, the Karakhanid Khanate, the first Muslim Turkish state in the world. Now, the exact origins of the Karakhanids are a bit unclear. Frustratingly, the Islamic sources don't really dwell on the matter, likely because the establishment of the Karakhanid Khanate involved embarrassing invasions into Samanid lands that were better left undiscussed. What we do know is that the Karakhanid Khanate formed in the wake of the collapse of the Uyghur Khanate far to the east. Just as the collapse of Tang authority on the steppe in the mid-8th century caused the turbulence that drove the Oghuz west 100 years earlier, the collapse of the Uyghur Khanate in the mid-9th century caused immense dislocation on the eastern steppe, which caused many people to flee west. Chinese sources claim that the confederation was born from a group of Uyghurs who fled west as the Uyghur Khanate collapsed. The Book of Sung says, "In the beginning, when the Uyghurs fled to the west, their tribes and clans scattered in different places. Therefore, there were the Kehan in Zhangye, the Kehan in Turfan, and the Karakhanids in Khotan. All are descendants of the Uyghurs." But modern historians believe that this is almost certainly not correct, at least not entirely. Perhaps the Chinese authors didn't really understand that all of the people ruled by the Uyghur Khanate were not Uyghurs, or maybe they're using the term Uyghur more broadly than we would use it. A wide range of theories has arisen, but most historians tend to accept the Karakhanid state was formed by factions within the Karluk Confederation along with refugees fleeing the turmoil of the east, including remnants of the old Ashina clan, descendants of the rulers of the long-gone First and Second Turkish Khanates. These disparate tribes from the east, these refugees, flooded into Karluk lands, and then they came together with the Karluks to form a new steppe confederation in the second half of the 9th century. Though we don't know if this was peaceful or violent, I would imagine there was both war and diplomacy. The rulers of this new confederation took the title Karakhan, meaning Black Khan in Turkish, or perhaps the Northern Khan, due to the Turks' usage of colors for the cardinal directions. Regardless of their origins, the Karakhanid elite, the core of the state, ended up speaking Karluk, the ancestor of modern Uzbek. From these shadowy origins, this new Khanate began to really establish itself in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Bolstered by arrivals from the east, this new Khanate arose in the old heartland of the Turgesh Khanate, the lands of modern-day Kyrgyzstan that the Karluks had held dominion over after the fall of Suluk and the Battle of Talas. From there it conquered east, taking large portions of Kashgar, westwards, taking the area to the east of the Oghuz Yabgu state and to the north of the Caliphate, that is between the Aral Sea and the Tian Shan and Pamir mountains. The Oghuz Yabgu state was indeed pushed out of large parts of the Sirdarya river plain, and thus squeezed between the rising new Khanate and the old faltering Khazar Khanate to the far west. And as we will discuss next time, this chaos in the steppe and the pressure from this mighty new Khanate would force some of the Oghuz to begin looking for greener pastures. Now, the Karakhanid Khanate came into existence just as the Samanid Emirate was establishing itself, and it was against the Karakhanids, alongside the Oghuz Yabgu state, that the great Samanid Jihad was principally launched, and to whom the Samanid missionaries would be sent. The mighty Samanid Emirate therefore constituted the main sedentary civilization that the nomadic Khanate orientated towards, and for the reasons we discussed earlier in the episode, conversion to Islam became more and more attractive and more common. By the mid-10th century at the latest, and likely by the early 10th century, the leadership of the Karakhanid Khanate had converted to Islam. This was likely accomplished under the reign of a leader called Satuk Bilge Khan. The conversion of a leader of the Turks usually was accompanied by the conversion of his family, as well as large numbers of his supporters, which explains the anecdotes of mass conversions that we see in the Islamic sources at the time. The introduction of Islam to the Karakhanid Khanate did more than just change the people's religion. It profoundly shaped the state's institutions. Islamic notions of government and Islamic models of government, the idea of governments composed of diwans, viziers, and ministries like those of the Samanids, came north. But remember that the Karakhanid Khanate was founded in part by Turkish elites who had come from the east, from the steppes bordering China and dominated by the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs had built a state of previously unseen sophistication on the steppes, surpassing even the old First Turkish Khanate at its height. When the people who would found this new Karakhanid state fled its collapse westwards, they brought with them the deep familiarity with the institutions of the Uyghur Khanate, institutions profoundly shaped by the First and Second Turkish Khanates and the Tang dynasty, institutions that could trace their lineage all the way back to the relations between the steppe world and China that we discussed in episode 1 of this podcast. And these institutions also deeply shaped the state that they would build. So the Karakhanid state was in essence a state based on Islamic, Uyghur, and Chinese models of government. I think a really great symbol of this are the early coins of the Karakhanids. They follow a basically Chinese form, also used by the Uyghurs, with a square hole in the center meant to allow the coins to be strung together on a string, but the coins also carry Arabic inscriptions around the edges, Islamic motifs impressed upon a Chinese and Uyghur model. To me, this is just a really good symbol for the state as a whole, and also a real sign of the sophistication of the state. This is the first Turkish political entity we've discussed on this podcast that actually struck coins, which is obviously not something done by classic steppe confederations. I mean, can you picture Suluk Khan minting coins? Even when he paid his soldiers' salaries, he paid them in balls of silk. Steppe nomads do not traditionally do stuff like this, and it really requires a very sophisticated bureaucracy to pull off. Which leads us to the nature of this Karakhanid state, this Khanate built on Islamic, Turkic, and Chinese models. On the top level, the state was in essence very similar to Turkic steppe confederations we've discussed previously. The state was divided in the traditional Turkish way of east-west/left-right division, the senior east and the junior west. Underneath the top 2 khans, one ruling each portion, there were 4 lesser khans, 2 in the east and 2 in the west. All of these khans were always members of the same royal family. And just like the other Turkic khanates that we've discussed, the Karakhanids retained the messy rules of the Turkish succession system, the rules tied to the Turkish concept of clan sovereignty. The state was in essence the collective property of the ruling clan as a whole, any member of whom could inherit. Also, like other Turkic khanates we've covered, the state functioned as a steppe confederation. It was multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, multicultural. Most people outside of the relatively small settlements lived the nomadic steppe lifestyle, traveling with their herds, and traditional tribal authorities retained great power underneath the top level of the political system. But grafted onto this traditional Turkish state structure was a civil service originally based on Uyghur and ultimately Chinese models, but further influenced by Islamic political traditions. This included a chief minister or chancellor, mostly called a hajab after the conversion to Islam, as well as a host of lesser-ranked officials performing various duties of the state. There were separate ministries responsible for various parts of the state's operation. Now, these ministries were originally based on the old Uyghur ministries inherited from the Chinese political tradition, but after the conversion to Islam, they were given a Muslim facelift, with new titles bestowed in lieu of the old Chinese and Uyghur titles. The senior offices of this civil service appear to have also been kept in the royal house as much as possible. At first, Chinese was used as an administrative language by the civil service, before being replaced by Arabic and Persian following the conversion to Islam. This civil service was an order of magnitude more sophisticated than anything seen on the steppe previously, particularly this far west. Perhaps only the Uyghur Khanate in the east had really achieved this level of sophistication. The Karakhanid state minted coins, as we have discussed, but also kept detailed records and had an organized taxation system, along with officers of state to oversee both the tribes and the settled peoples the state ruled. Such a sophisticated state could not really be maintained on the move, of course, and the Karakhanids are the first steppe state we've encountered that actually built a capital city. Now, the Uyghur Khanate had built a capital city in Ötüken, in the holy land of the First and Second Turkish Khanates. But in this podcast, we haven't seen a true capital city for a steppe empire yet. Now, we have seen the stages of development that led up to this. In the Turgesh Khanate, Suyab acted as a semi-capital. In essence, the Khan would often camp near the city, and the city would be used to house a portion of the treasury and perhaps a minor state staff. Think maybe people who could take messages being sent to the Khan from foreign courts and direct the embassies on how to get to wherever the Khan happened to be at the time. Then the Oghuz Yabgu state used Yenikent in a more permanent way, with the Yabgu himself staying in Yenikent during the winters and returning to the steppe in the summers, likely staying within a reasonable distance from his semi-capital. While the Karakhanids went beyond this, they had real capital cities. In the west, this would first be at Balasagun, a Sogdian Silk Road city of moderate size close to Suyab. Indeed, the Karakhanids essentially moved the semi-capital at Suyab that the Karluks had inherited from the Turgesh to Balasugun, and the city soon eclipsed Suyab as the main city in the region. In the east, the Karakhanids would come to use the great Silk Road city of Kashgar as their capital. These cities would house not just the apparatus of the state, the mints, the treasuries, the record keepers, the tax collectors, the ministries, the courts, and so on, but the Khans themselves. The Khans, though ruling over a nomadic empire, in essence became sedentary. Yeah, they would still ride out to the steppe, they would still present themselves to their nomadic subjects in the traditional manner of the steppe, but for all intents and purposes, they ceased to live the nomadic life. I think we should imagine this taking place slowly. The Khan starts by wintering in the city, and then starts departing for the steppe later and later in the spring and returning earlier and earlier in the autumn. As he spends less time on the steppe, the royal palace he builds needs to be improved, which of course makes returning to living in a felt tent less and less appealing. Soon he only goes out to the steppe intermittently for in essence camping trips, or else to meet and greet his nomadic subjects. And in becoming sedentary, the Khans inevitably became culturally closer to the sedentary peoples who resided in their capitals, and these peoples were of course tied to the culture of the neighboring sedentary civilization, be it Islamic or Chinese. After the conversion to Islam, soon the Khans came to speak Persian and Arabic, worship in a mosque, and in essence join the Islamic civilization imported from the Samanid Emirate and the Caliphate more broadly. They came to see themselves as Muslim rulers, participating in the broader Islamic political world of the sedentary people they bordered. And as we will come to see under the Seljuks, this will, in time, lead to conflict between the sedentary Islamized court and the nomadic tribes upon whom the court depends. Now we can really see the mixture of Islamic, Chinese, and Turkish political traditions in the titles that the Karakhanids started to use. In the east, the eastern Khans would style themselves as Tabkach, a title for steppe warlords going all the way back to the days following the collapse of the Han dynasty, and which meant roughly King of China. They would also call themselves King, Khan, and Sultan of China, which I just love because it highlights the big three influences on their state: Chinese, Turkish, and Islamic. And in the west, the Arabic titles of Malik al-Mashriq, King of the East, and Mawla al-Ma'mumin, Agent of the Caliph, and Mawla al-Rasulullah, Agent of the Messenger of God, were all used, particularly on coins. I think my favorite title is Sultan al-Sharq wal al-Sin, Arabic for King of the East and China, essentially laying claim to the legacy of the old Tang Protectorate General to pacify the West, but in the language of Islamic rule. So by the end of the 10th century, the Karakhanids had established a powerful state just to the north of the Samanid Emirate, a state of unseen sophistication for the steppe. And importantly, it was a Muslim state, both deeply influenced by Islamic political traditions and comprehensible to Muslims living within the Caliphate. As the Muslims living within the Samanid Emirate came to become familiar with this new Khanate, they gave it a new name. Poetically, for the overtly Persian Samanids, they chose the name the House of Afrasiyab, an homage to the Shahnameh, the great Persian Book of Kings, then being written in the Samanid Emirate by the great Ferdowsi. In the heroic portion of the Shahnameh, Afrasiyab is the great lord of Turan, the land of the Turks on the steppes north of Iran. He is the chief antagonist of the Persians, but also a man of great intelligence, courage, and even generosity. In the Shahnameh, Afrasiyab invades Iran multiple times, taking advantage of its political turmoil and division. It would prove to be a fitting name for the Karakhanids. As the Karakhanid Khanate coalesced and began to come into its own in the late 10th century, the Samanid Emirate began faltering. As we discussed last time, the great Samanid Jihad sputtered out after the reign of the great Ismail, and his son Ahmad had created a vast Turkish slave army to crush the rival Safarid Emirate and balance the power of the Iranian nobility. This in turn led to Ahmad being killed by his own Turkish slave soldiers, of course. Following his death, the Samanid Emirate stabilized under the reign of Nasser II and reached the apex of its prosperity and power, but with the Turkish slave generals now in a dominant position, given great lands and powerful offices of state, in essence, becoming emirs in their own rights. And that's about where we left off. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, things took a turn for the worse for the Samanids in basically the exact same way that had happened for the early Abbasids. The Turkish slave soldiers decided that it just made more sense for them to run things. Shocking, I know. This is sort of one of the real-life lessons of this podcast, I think. Creating a massive Turkish slave army is just a very bad idea. As much as you may want to, just don't do it. It will not turn out well for you or for your state. And so it would be for Nasser II. Eventually, a group of Turkish slave soldiers angry at Nasser II's religious policies felt that they could do better with a more pliant emir on the top, and they plotted to assassinate him. Nasser II's son Nuh uncovered the plot and then confronted his father, telling him that it would be better for his health if he retired now instead of staying on to fight the inevitable. And so Nasser II abdicated and Nuh was raised up as emir. Naturally, this led to widespread revolt across the emirate, and this revolt would completely destabilize the Samanid Emirate, leading to its total collapse both from within and from without. From within, the Turkish slave generals would rise up to take what they felt was rightfully theirs, and from without, the young Karakhanid Khanate would sweep down from the steppes. Now, things actually started off going not all that badly for the Samanids in this revolt. Nuh was able to suppress the initial revolts against his new rule pretty quickly, but in doing so, he was again forced to rely heavily on the Turkish slave army. In particular, Ibrahim ibn Simjur, the son of the great Turkish slave general Simjur, who had been appointed by Nasser II to be governor of Bukhara, was critical to putting down the revolt. Nuh was therefore forced to reward Ibrahim ibn Simjur with even greater offices, appointing him governor of Khorasan in addition to his role as governor of Bukhara. But then, of course, the sitting governor of Khorasan refused to step down, leading to another revolt. This revolt was so successful that Nuh was even driven from the Samanid capital of Bukhara, and the rebels propped up his uncle as emir. Nuh was then able to rally his Turkish slave army and drive the rebels out, even blinding his uncle as punishment, and reassert himself as the emir. But in relying on his Turkish soldiers so extensively, Nuh was now deeply dependent on them. The Turkish slave army had become the true power behind the state, and its generals were becoming emirs in their own rights. Nuh had been forced to give them governorships and other great offices of state, such as the office of Grand Vizier, which was just a scandal for the sophisticated Persians of the Samanid Emirate. A barbarian Turkish slave from the steppe was now a vizier. For the new Turkish governors, their appointment included the right to collect taxes from the provinces to keep them loyal, and a great many Turkish slave officers were granted ikta, those tax-forming fiefs born out of the anarchy at Samarra that we discussed in episode 18. And so the slave army came to be more than just the key to propping up Nuh on the throne. It came to be the throne, while the Turkish slave generals were becoming more and more aware of the power that they held over the state. And as always, conflicts quickly began to emerge between the slave generals and factions of the slave army. The underlying process that drove the anarchy at Samarra was now playing out again in miniature, ironically within one of the emirates founded as a consequence of the anarchy. The process accelerated under the reign of Nuh's son and heir, Abd al-Malik, who ascended to the throne in 954 at the tender age of 19 upon Nuh's death. Immediately, the state descended into rebellion and chaos. Mostly these were rebellions by the Iranian nobility, who, as we discussed previously, already resented the centralization of power in the hands of the emir, and now they detested that this centralized power was in the hands of barbarian Turkish slaves. Again, the center was able to reassert its power and crush the rebellions, but again, the Turkish military men gained more and more power. In particular, Abd al-Malik was forced to appoint a man named Alp Tegin, the head of the emir's personal bodyguard and the head of the military, to be the Grand Vizier and then to be the governor of Khorasan for his aid in putting down these rebellions, which immediately infuriated the current governor of Khorasan, the Simjurid Abu Hassan Simjuri, who was then given Kohistan and Bukhara as compensation. But Alp Tegin got his protege, a Turkish slave general named Balami, to be appointed as Grand Vizier, thus essentially keeping both offices for himself. The coming Seljuk Grand Vizier Nizam ul Mulk writes of Alp-Tegin, "In Khorasan and Transoxiana he possessed estates amounting of 500 villages. Nor was there a city in the Samanid kingdom where he did not own houses, gardens, inns, bathhouses, and farms. In addition, he had 1 million sheep and more than 100,000 horses, mules, and camels." This created a cleavage, a rivalry between these two great Turkish generals, a rivalry that would end up destroying the Samanid Emirate. Under Abd al-Malik's reign, the power of the slave soldiers became essentially absolute. The idea that the civil administration and the emir were running the show was becoming an increasingly tiny fig leaf, attempting to cover up the reality of Turkish military might. When Abd al-Malik died in 961 after falling from his horse while playing polo, the fig leaf itself was discarded. With there being no clear heir, rival camps within the Turkish slave army propped up separate emirs, and the Turkish slave soldiers ransacked the palace. I think it's important to remember that the Turkish slave soldiers came from the Turkish political tradition, where the state was seen as being essentially the collective property of the ruling clan as a whole, any member of whom could inherit. The Turkish slave soldiers brought these ideas from the steppe with them, and then naturally applied them to the succession system in the emirate they notionally served. From their perspective, all of the members of the ruling family had a claim, and of course, the state should go to the strongest. And that meant that everyone had to find some member of the ruling family that they could use as a puppet. In the words of the historian Abu Bakr ibn Jafar Narshaki, "When they buried him, the army grew restless and rebelled. Everyone coveted the kingdom, and troubles raised their heads." The primary division, of course, was between Alp-Tegin and the Simjurids. Alp-Tegin, now based in Khorasan as the governor, had his protege, the Turkish Grand Vizier Balami, rush to grab Abd al-Malik's young son Nasser III and make him emir, a puppet emir that he could rule through. Unfortunately for Alp-Tegin, Nasser III lasted on the throne for literally 1 day. The Persian civil administration allied with key members of the Samanid family, as well as the Simjurids, to induce the defection of Balami. This got the Turkish garrison in Bukhara itself to switch sides, overthrow Nasser III, and place one of Nuh's sons, Mansur I, on the throne. Alp-Tegin was therefore isolated, and of course Mansur I, with the backing of the Simjurids, dismissed Alp-Tegin and sent an army to Khorasan to bring him back to Bukhara to have a little chat about his future career prospects. Naturally, Alp-Tegin decided not to stick around. He instead decided to flee to the southeast, to the furthest fringe of the emirate. With a small contingent of Turkish slave troops, he fled to the city of Ghazna in the Hindu Kush Mountains in modern-day Afghanistan. He then summoned to him as many Turkish slave troops as he could get his hands on. He initially hoped that he would lick his wounds in Ghazna and be able to make an attempt for power back in Bukhara again. But while camped out in Ghazna, Alp-Tegin became not just the lord of Ghazna, he became an emir in his own right. Because instead of just sitting on this southeastern fringe of the emirate looking back to the west from whence he had come, he soon began looking further to the south and the east, and he saw that the rich lands of Afghanistan and even India beyond could potentially be more than just a consolation prize. And so he made a deal with his old rivals in Bukhara, accepted his status as a nominal Samanid vassal, and began to carve out a kingdom for himself. Thus, Alp-Tegin became the first slave king, and inaugurated the famed and fearsome Ghaznavid Empire. Alp-Tegin would die in 963, shortly after completing the conquest of Ghazna and the surrounding territory in Afghanistan. He would be succeeded by his son-in-law, another great Turkish slave general named Sebuktegin, whose name means the beloved prince in Old Turkish. Sebuktegin had been purchased as a slave by Alp-Tegin, and he quickly rose through the ranks of the Samanid armies under Alp-Tegin. Alp-Tegin came to love and trust the young man, and Sebuktegin even managed to marry Alp-Tegin's daughter. After Alp-Tegin's death, he was briefly succeeded by his son, before Sebuktegin drove Alp-Tegin's son out and seized power for himself. And it would be under Sebuktegin that the great Ghaznavid invasions of India would begin. Invasions that would reach the Indus Valley and even beyond, and lay waste to the Hindu principalities of northern India, carrying vast, vast riches and wealth back to Ghazna. And this will not, I assure you, be the last we hear of the House of Ghazna. Meanwhile, back in the central lands of the Samanid Emirate, While Mansur I was able to claw back some power into the hands of the royal house, his success would be short-lived. The slave army was just too powerful, and the Simjurids in particular had really become emirs in their own right. Emirs who were coming to rule the central lands of the emirate. Meanwhile, the Samanids were coming into conflict with their neighbors, the Buyids in Iran, who we will discuss in more detail in a later episode. And as the slave army was consumed in internal struggles for power, or else had been taken off to Ghazna, the Buyids were starting to come out on top in these struggles. Mansur I died in 976, and by the 980s and early 990s, the Samanid dynasty was tottering. So as the Samanid dynasty began to falter, two great Turkish dynasties emerged out of it. Nominally, they were merely governors of the Samanid provinces, but that fiction was wearing increasingly thin. These were really emirs running their own states, at war with each other, with other Turkish slave army factions, and with outside emirates. And as the Turkish slave generals became Turkish emirs, as the Samanid Emirate itself began to dissolve into Turkish emirates only nominally under Samanid suzerainty, across the frontier, the Karakhanids watched the unfolding chaos with interest. And the Karakhanids ultimately decided that this was an opportunity that you just can't pass up. As always, chaos and weakness in the settled state resulted in the nomads seeing what they could get away with. But whereas past nomadic assaults on settled peoples that we have covered on this podcast were essentially raiding, the nomads riding in and taking what they could, the Karakhanids would attempt something different. They would attempt to conquer and directly rule the settled peoples. Now, this isn't something we've really seen on the podcast to date. If you think back to the first Turkish Khanate when China or Iran were weak, the Turks would ride in, plunder, maraud, take what they wanted or who they wanted, and then return back home to the steppe. And while the first and second Khanates and the Turgesh were of course interested in indirectly ruling over settled peoples, they didn't actually aspire to directly rule them. Think about Suluk's hegemony over the Sogdian city-states in this very same region of the world almost 300 years earlier. Suluk did not aspire to directly administer the Silk Road city-states that the Karakhanid Khanate will in time come to conquer. He was content to collect tribute and call upon the city-states when he went to war. He was essentially running a mafia-style protection racket. The Karakhanid Khanate was different. It aspired to directly rule these city-states, to bring them into the Khanate. Indeed, it would come to rule from these cities itself. The Karakhanid assaults began in 992. Massive hordes swept into the lands of Transoxiana from the north and the east, an echo, in a sense, of the Göktürk invasion over 400 years earlier and the campaigns of Suluk almost 300 years earlier. Bukhara fell the same year. It appears that at the same time that they were invading the Samanid domains, the Karakhanids were also establishing their control over the Tarim Basin, conquering Khotan and Kucha. While the Karakhanids could not hold Bukhara this time, the fact that the very capital of the Samanid Emirate had fallen is telling, and while the capital was retaken by a Samanid and Simjurid force, the Karakhanids were able to capture large swaths of territory, the very heartlands of the dying Samanid Emirate. Meanwhile, the Ghaznavids began to gobble up the rest of the former Samanid domains from their base in Ghazna. In 997, Sebuktegin died and was succeeded by his son, the world-famous Mahmud of Ghazna, whose name is to this day cursed in India and sung in Pakistan. And as we will discuss next time, Mahmud will come to play not just a great role in the history of India, but in the history of the Turks. Finally, in the year 999, both the Ghaznavids and the Karakhanids again invaded the heartlands of the Samanid Emirate. Together, they finished the job and the Samanid Emirate was finally ended. The Simjurids, that other great Turkish slave general household, fought for the Samanids, likely seeing that both the Ghaznavids and the Karakhanids were an existential threat. But to no avail. The last Simjurid emir was caught and executed by Mahmud of Ghazna. Bukhara fell to the Karakhanids again, this time for good. The Samanid dynasty was carted off. Though they would attempt to come back in the future, their rule was finished for all intents and purposes. The great city of Samarkand would become the western capital of the Karakhanid Khanate several years later. The elites of the Karakhanids did not stay as steppe nomads. Instead, they moved into the cities they conquered. They even built great structures throughout the cities of their domains, including the world-famous Kalyan minaret in Bukhara. Indeed, under the Karakhanids, Something of a renaissance began in Bukhara and Samarkand. And so it was that the Samanid domains, the lands of the emirate dedicated to the resurrection of Persian culture, came to be ruled by Turks. The Ghaznavid Ghulam state, the slave empire, and the Karakhanid Khanate, the sophisticated Turkish steppe invader. These two states came to divide the lands and cities of the Samanid Emirate between them. The Amu Darya River, the old traditional border between Iran and Central Asia, quickly came to serve as their border. Now it's important to note that while both the Ghaznavid Ghulam state and the Karakhanid Khanate were states led by Turks, they were actually pretty different. When the slave generals and their officers were given the great estates and offices, they basically took over parts of the existing Samanid Emirate. In essence, just as how during the anarchy at Samarra, the Abbasid Caliphate had delegated the right to rule to the emirates in the first place, now the Samanid Emirate in essence delegated the right to rule to the Turkish emirs in their new capacity as governors, whereupon the governors then became emirs and then sultans in their own rights. The Turkish slave generals therefore hijacked the existing Samanid institutions, mostly staffed by Persians, and turned them into truly independent states in their own rights as the Samanid Emirate collapsed. By contrast, the Karakhanid Khanate was a truly external actor. As we have covered in this episode, it had its own state institutions of the Turkish steppe tradition that have been covered on this podcast since the beginning. But the state's Islamic character was absolutely critical to its eventual conquest of portions of the Samanid Emirate, as indeed on some level was the existence of the Turkish slave emirates. These made the population used to the idea of Muslim Turkish rule. The nobility, the civil officials who were critical to the functioning of the state, were by now accustomed to the idea of being ruled by Turks, so long as they were Muslims and operated within the political structures that had arisen since the anarchy. Because the Karakhanids were Muslims, and indeed Muslims who professed Sunniism and theoretical loyalty to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, their rule was made acceptable to the local population. Rule by infidel Turks was a non-starter, but rule by Muslim Turks? Well, how different was that from the Turkish emirs? I mean, those Turkish slave generals were themselves the products of the steppe. What's the real difference here from the perspective of an Iranian noble or official or merchant or scholar? But now that they had jointly finished off the Samanid Emirate, the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids of course quickly came into conflict themselves. While the Ghaznavids were in general preoccupied with raiding India and growing fabulously wealthy in the process, they were always mindful of their origins in the borderlands of Iran and the frontier with the steppe world. Meanwhile, the Karakhanids, though enmeshed with the world of Central Asia and relations with China, were ever mindful of the growing strength and power of the Ghaznavid Ghulam state. War broke out multiple times between the two sides in the early 11th century. But we should also remember that while relations could be tense and indeed bloody, the two states also had more peaceful relations. There are records of marriage alliances and fabulously wealthy trade missions, the plundered riches of India and the purchased riches of China crossing the Amu Darya. But as the Karakhanid Khanate and the Ghaznavid Ghulam state fell into their pattern of war and peace, trading and raiding, violence and alliance, events were underway that would utterly upend all of Central Asia and indeed all of the world. Because to the north and the west of the civilized Karakhanid Khanate, the House of Afrasiyab, a more uncooked Turkish people, the Oghuz, had been thrown into upheaval by the changes that had rocked Central Asia. And as we will discuss next time, the rise of the Karakhanids and the weakening of the Khazar Khanate to the west combined with climatic change to throw the steppe world into chaos. And fleeing from this chaos, the Oghuz Turks were being pushed into the domains of the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids. Indeed, they were already involved, because back in 999, when the Karakhanids and the Ghaznavids had worked together to finish off the Samanid dynasty, the Samanid dynasty had in fact called upon an obscure and minor leader of the Oghuz to aid them in their desperate last struggle, a leader with the name of Seljuk.